They had one. That was the simplest way to put it. The old couple, the ones left for dead in a roadside motel with nothing but the clothes on their backs and $100 folded into a worn leather wallet, had one. They stood on a small patch of gravel they now called home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. Behind them, a converted workshop hummed with a quiet, industrious energy. A single light flickered on above the main door, a small beacon against the encroaching dark. In front of them, parked like an old loyal dog, was the truck. It was a monument of rust and dents, a testament to a time long past, but its engine could turn over with a growl that promised another day's work. This truck, once an object of ridicule, a forgotten relic in a dusty storage lot, had been their salvation. It had held a secret, welded into its very frame by a father long gone, a secret that had given them the means not for revenge, but for resurrection. Their son, the architect of their ruin, was a ghost, a name spoken only in whispers of disbelief by those who knew the story. Their daughter was a hesitant visitor, slowly, painfully rebuilding a bridge she had allowed to burn. The life they had was not the one they had planned, not the comfortable, quiet retirement they had earned over 50 years of hard work and sacrifice. It was something else entirely. It was harder, and it was better. It was theirs. But to understand how Helen and Frank arrived at this quiet, improbable victory, you have to go back. You have to go back to the silence of a sterile motel room, the smell of bleach and despair, and the moment they realized they had been erased. The house was sold. It had been a simple, sturdy two-story colonial in a quiet suburb, the kind of house that holds the echoes of a family's entire history. It was where Frank had taught their son, Mark, to ride a bike, wobbling precariously on the driveway until he finally found his balance. It was where Helen had measured the children's height in pencil marks on a doorframe, a ladder of ascending lines that charted their growth from toddlers to teenagers. 52 years they had lived within those walls. Frank had replaced the roof himself, twice. Helen had planted the rose bushes that now climbed the trellis by the front porch, their thorns as familiar to her as their blossoms. Every squeak in the floorboards, every stubborn window, every patch of worn carpet was a part of their shared memory. Selling it had been Mark's idea. He had arrived one Sunday afternoon, his suit too sharp, his smile too bright. He spread glossy brochures across their worn oak dining table, the one Frank had refinished the year they were married. The pictures showed smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard, taking watercolor classes, and dining in a sun-drenched hall. "It's called Golden Meadows," Mark had said, his voice brimming with a salesman's enthusiasm. "It's perfect. No more mowing the lawn, Frank. No more worrying about the boiler going out. Everything is taken care of. You've earned it." Helen had felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She was a bookkeeper by trade, long retired, but the instincts remained. She was a woman of ledgers and receipts, of tangible proof. These brochures were just pictures. "It looks expensive, Mark," she had said, her voice quiet. "Don't you worry about that, Mom," he'd laughed, patting her hand. "I've run the numbers. The sale of this house will cover the buy-in completely, with plenty left over for a nice nest egg for you both. I'll handle all the paperwork, the transfers, everything. You won't have to lift a finger." Frank, whose hands were gnarled from a lifetime of working with tools and engines, had looked down at those hands. The idea of not lifting a finger felt alien to him. He was a man who found purpose in fixing things. A leaky faucet, a sputtering car engine, a broken chair leg. These were the small, solvable problems that made up a good life. What would he fix in a place where everything was perfect? But he saw the hope in his son's eyes, the earnest desire to provide for them, or so he thought. He looked at Helen, at the worry lines etched around her eyes, and thought of the steep staircase that was getting harder for her every year. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe it was time. Their daughter, Susan, had been more passive. When Helen called her, she was distracted, the sound of her own children loud in the background. "Oh, that sounds nice, Mom. Mark is so good at that stuff. If he says it's a good deal, I'm sure it is. We'll have to come visit you at the new place." Her easy acceptance had soothed some of Helen's fears. If both their children thought it was a good idea, who were they to argue? They had raised them to be smart, to be successful. This was just Mark, their brilliant son, taking care of them in their old age. The process was a blur. Mark was a whirlwind of efficiency. He brought papers to sign, arranged for movers, and managed the bank accounts. He was patient and kind, explaining complex financial documents in simple terms. This just gives me power of attorney to handle the sale and the transfer of funds to the Golden Meadows account, he had said, sliding a pen across the table. It's just a formality. Makes everything smoother. They had signed. They trusted him. He was their son. The last day in the house was the hardest. The rooms were cavernous and empty, their voices echoing in a way they never had before. The pencil marks on the doorframe were gone. Painted over by the crew Mark had hired to make the house market-ready, Helen had stood in the empty living room, her hand tracing the faint outline of where their sofa had been for 30 years, and felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were already a ghost in her own life. Frank had walked through the garage one last time, his hand brushing against the cold, empty space on the wall where his favorite wrenches used to hang. Mark arrived to pick them up, his car gleaming in the driveway. He was cheerful, almost giddy. On to the next adventure, he declared, loading their few suitcases into the trunk. They had packed only what they would need for a few weeks. The rest of their belongings, the carefully curated remnants of a lifetime, were in a storage unit, waiting to be moved into their new apartment at Golden Meadows. They drove for hours, much longer than Helen had expected. The suburbs gave way to flat, uninteresting countryside. "Mark, are you sure this is the right way?" she finally asked as the sun began to set. "Almost there, Mom. There's just a small delay with the apartment. Some last-minute plumbing issues. But I've got all sorted. I booked you into a lovely hotel for a night or two on me. You can relax, have a nice dinner, and by the time you're checked out, your new place will be ready." The lovely hotel was the Sleep-Tight Motor Inn, a low-slung building with a flickering neon sign and a parking lot full of semi-trucks. The paint was peeling, and the air smelled of diesel fumes and damp carpet. A profound sense of wrongness washed over Helen. This was not a small delay. This was something else. Mark checked them in, his cheerfulness now strained. He walked them to their room. It was small and grim. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, thin and rough to the touch. A bulky, old-fashioned television was bolted to the dresser. The window looked out onto a concrete wall. "It's just for a night," he said, avoiding their eyes. He placed the key card on the nightstand. "I've got to run. I have an early meeting tomorrow to sort all this out. I'll call you in the morning." He hugged them both quickly, a stiff, awkward gesture. "I love you guys." And then he was gone. They stood in the silence of the room, the hum of the ancient air conditioner the only sound. Frank walked over to the window and stared at the concrete wall. Helen sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning in protest. She opened her purse. Inside was the $100 Mark had pressed into her hand. "For dinner and breakfast," he had said. The phone call never came. The first day, they waited. They bought stale donuts and coffee from the lobby and sat in the room, watching the television with the sound off. Helen called Mark's phone. It went straight to voicemail. She left a message. "Mark, it's Mom. Just calling to see what time you think you'll be here. Call us back." The second day, the worry began to curdle into fear. Helen called again and again. Voicemail every time. She called Susan. "Oh, Mom, I'm sure he's just busy. You know how he is with work. He probably just got tied up. The deal will go through. Don't worry." By the third day, the fear had become a cold, hard certainty. Helen walked to the payphone in the lobby. Her cell phone had been part of a family plan that was now, she discovered, disconnected, and called the Golden Meadows Retirement Community. She spoke to a pleasant-sounding woman in admissions. "We don't have any record of a Frank or Helen Miller," the woman said after a long pause. "And there's no apartment being held. We are fully booked with a 2-year waiting list." "I'm so sorry." Helen hung up the phone, her hand trembling. She walked back to the room, each step heavy. Frank was sitting on the bed, staring at the blank television screen. He looked up as she came in, his face a mask of tired hope. "There's no apartment," she said, her voice flat. There was never an apartment. The truth settled over them, vast and suffocating. The house was gone. The money was gone. Their son was gone. They were in a town they didn't know, in a motel room paid for by the day, with less than $50 to their name. They had been erased. The days that followed were a blur of humiliation and despair. They rationed their money, eating cheap crackers and instant soup heated in the room's grimy coffee maker. Frank, a man of immense physical pride, seemed to shrink. He spent hours just staring out the window, his big, capable hands lying useless in his lap. Helen, the bookkeeper, felt a frantic, impotent rage. She had spent her life balancing ledgers, making sure every penny was accounted for. Her own son had taken everything, and she had no ledger to prove it, only the worthless deed of a power of attorney she had so trustingly signed. They tried the police. A young, bored-looking officer took their statement in the motel lobby. "So, your son sold your house, and you don't know where the money is?" he asked, chewing on the end of his pen. "And you signed over power of attorney?" "Ma'am, this sounds like a family dispute. A civil matter. You'll need to hire a lawyer." Hire a lawyer. The words were a bitter joke. They couldn't afford another night at the motel, let alone a lawyer. They were invisible. Two old people with a story so sad and pathetic it was almost unbelievable. They had fallen through the cracks of the world. One night, Helen lay awake, listening to the rumble of trucks on the highway and the sound of Frank's troubled breathing beside her. The despair was a physical weight on her chest. She thought of her parents, long gone. Her mother, a worrier just like her. Her father, a quiet, stoic man. He had been a mechanic too, like Frank, but also a tinkerer, a man who saw value in things others threw away. He had left her almost nothing in his will, just a few sentimental items and one strange, specific bequest. His old, beat-up 1968 Ford F-250 pickup truck. Frank had always called it that pile of junk. It had been sitting in a long-term storage lot an hour from their old house for the better part of 2 decades. They paid a small annual fee to keep it there, something Helen did out of stubborn, sentimental loyalty to her father's memory. It was an expense Frank had grumbled about every year. Now, lying in the dark, the thought of the truck surfaced in her mind like a piece of wreckage. It was an asset, a worthless, rusted, forgotten asset, but it was theirs. It was the only thing left in the world that belonged to them. She sat up in bed. "Frank," she whispered. "Frank, wake up." He stirred, his voice thick with sleep. "What is it?" "The truck," she said, her own voice trembling with a strange, unfamiliar flicker of something that wasn't despair. "My father's truck. It's still there, in the storage lot." Frank was silent for a long moment. "Helen, that thing hasn't run in 20 years. It's a heap of rust. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's ours," she said, the words gaining strength. "I'm thinking it's all we have. We have the title. It's in my name." She reached over and turned on the cheap lamp by the bed. In the harsh, yellow light, she saw the deep grooves of exhaustion and defeat on her husband's face. She put her hand on his arm. "Frank, we can't stay here. We have $7 left. Tomorrow, they're going to lock us out of this room. We can't just sit here and die." He looked at her, at the fierce, desperate light that had come into her eyes. He was a man of action, and for weeks he had been paralyzed by inaction. He had been waiting for something to happen, for some authority to step in and fix this terrible mistake. Now he saw the truth in Helen's face. No one was coming. They were on their own. The idea was terrifying, and, in a strange way, it was also liberating. "The storage lot is 60 miles from here," he said, his voice practical for the first time in weeks. "How do we get there?" "We'll use the $7 to take the bus as far as it goes," Helen said, her mind already working, calculating, planning. "And then we'll walk." It was a crazy, desperate plan, but it was a plan, and for the first time since their son had driven away and left them in this dingy room, it felt like they were moving forward, not just waiting for the end. Frank finally nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Okay, Helen," he said. "Okay." The bus ride was long and rattling. They sat in the back, 2 anonymous old people in worn clothes, staring out the window at a world that no longer seemed to have a place for them. They got off at a desolate crossroads, 10 miles from the storage facility. The sun was high and hot. The air was thick with the smell of asphalt and dust. They started walking. Frank, who had a bad knee, walked with a slight limp. Helen's feet, in their thin-soled shoes, began to ache after the first mile. They didn't talk much. They just put one foot in front of the other, a slow, grim procession of two. Cars sped past them, kicking up clouds of grit. No one stopped. No one even looked. They were just part of the scenery, as invisible as roadside weeds. It took them nearly 4 hours to cover the 10 miles. By the time they reached the chain-link fence of the U-Store-It lot, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in a fine layer of grime. The manager, a large man with a suspicious squint, looked them up and down. "Can I help you?" Helen, summoning the last of her strength, presented the key to their unit and the crumpled payment receipt from the previous year. "Unit 74, she said, her voice raspy. "We've come for our vehicle." The man led them down a long row of identical roll-up metal doors. He unlocked theirs and heaved it open. The sound was like a groan of protest. And there it was. It was worse than Frank had remembered. The truck was a hulking beast of faded seafoam green and encroaching rust. The tires were flat and cracked. A thick layer of dust and grime coated every surface, so thick that Helen could write her name in it. Cobwebs draped from the side mirrors like funeral shrouds. It didn't look like a vehicle. It looked like a carcass. "That pile of junk," Frank muttered, the word a sigh of defeat. All that walking, all that desperate hope for this. Helen didn't answer. She walked slowly around the truck, her hand trailing through the dust. This was her father's. He had loved this truck. He had spent countless hours in the garage with it, his hands covered in grease, a look of serene concentration on his face. She pulled on the stiff driver's side door. It opened with a piercing shriek of metal on metal. The air inside was stale and hot, the smell of old vinyl and decay. She slid onto the cracked bench seat. The stuffing was coming out in yellowed clumps. She opened the glove compartment. It was stuck. She jiggled it, then pulled harder. It sprang open, showering her lap with a cascade of old maps, dried-up pens, and fossilized gas station receipts. And something else, a large manila envelope. Her fingers, stiff and clumsy, fumbled to open it. Inside was the official certificate of title for the truck, clean and crisp. And tucked inside the folded title was a single, small piece of paper, a note written in her father's spidery, left-leaning script. She unfolded it. It read, "The real value isn't what you see, but what holds it together." She stared at the words. It was exactly the kind of cryptic, frustrating thing her father would write. He was a man who communicated in riddles and object lessons. What did it mean? Well, hold it together. The engine? The frame. Frank had opened the hood, and the sound of him sighing was loud in the quiet storage unit. Batteries shot. Belts are rotten. Hoses are probably all cracked. The whole thing seized up. I bet he slammed the hood shut, a gesture of finality. "It's hopeless, Helen. We walked all this way for a scrap heap." Helen slid out of the truck, holding the note in her hand. She looked at her husband, at his slumped shoulders and the utter despair in his eyes. This was the moment. They could give up, lie down in the dust of this forgotten storage unit, and let the world have its way with them. Or they could fight. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid as steel. "It's not hopeless." She held out the note. "Read this." Frank took the note and squinted at it. "What's this supposed to mean?" "Well, hold it together, welds hold it together. Bolts hold it together." "It's nonsense. My father never did anything without a reason," Helen insisted. "This note means something. And this truck is the only thing we have left. You are a mechanic, Frank. You are the best mechanic I have ever known. You can fix anything. You can fix this." He looked from the note to the truck, then to his wife's face. He saw the dust on her cheeks, the exhaustion in her eyes. But he also saw a core of unbreakable will, a resolve that shamed his own despair. She believed in him. After everything they had lost, that one thing remained. She believed in him. A flicker of the old Frank, the man who could diagnose an engine by its sound, the man who relished a challenge, returned. He took a deep breath, the dusty air filling his lungs. He walked back to the truck and opened the driver's side door. He slid behind the wheel, his hands settling on it as if greeting an old friend. "It's still standing," he said, more to himself than to her. Helen nodded, a slow, firm gesture of confirmation. She had made the choice. Now it was his turn. He looked at her, a long, searching look. A lifetime of partnership, of shared burdens and quiet understanding, passed between them in that single glance. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. "All right, Helen," he said, his voice rough. "Let's see what we've got." The decision was made. The long, slow climb back had begun. They had a vehicle, but it was, for all intents and purposes, a 5,000-pound paperweight. Their first home was the dusty concrete floor of the storage unit. The manager, a man named Henderson, was initially hostile to the idea of them living there, but Helen, with the last vestiges of her bookkeeper's authority, showed him their contract. It stipulated 24-hour access, but said nothing about overnight stays. Henderson, seeing a potential legal headache he didn't want, grudgingly agreed to look the other way, so long as they were gone by the time he opened in the morning and back after he closed at night. Their days fell into a new, strange rhythm. They would leave the storage lot at dawn, walking to a nearby gas station to use the restroom and wash their faces. They would spend their days at the public library, Helen researching local resources, Frank reading old auto repair manuals, refreshing his memory. At dusk, they would return to the storage unit, to the silent, hulking presence of the truck. Frank began his work. It was a slow, painstaking process. He had no tools. His first task was to take inventory, to create a list of everything he would need. He worked by the dim light of a single flashlight they had bought with the change collected from the libraries. Take a penny, leave a penny tray. He lay on his back on the cold concrete, peering up at the truck's undercarriage. He ran his hands over the engine block, his fingers reading the metal like braille. "We need a battery to start," he announced after the first night of inspection, "and a full set of sockets, and wrenches, and new belts, and hoses, and oil, and coolant." The list grew longer every night. It was a mountain of needs, and they had no resources. This was Helen's domain. At the library, she had found a list of local auto parts stores. She started making calls from the library's public phone. The first few calls were brutal. She would explain their situation, her voice calm and rational, and would be met with polite but firm rejections. "Sorry, ma'am, we don't offer credit. We can't just give away parts." Each no was a small death. But Helen was persistent. She was a woman who had once spent 3 days tracking down a 7-cent discrepancy in a corporate budget. She would not be deterred. On her 5th call, she reached a place called Hobbs Auto and Marine. A gruff, gravelly voice answered. "Hobbs." Helen took a breath and began her now-practiced speech. "My name is Helen Miller. My husband is a retired mechanic. We have a vehicle, a 1968 Ford F-250, that we're trying to get running. We have no tools and no money for parts at this moment. We are looking for a supplier who would be willing to extend us a line of credit to be paid back as soon as the vehicle is operational." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Helen expected the familiar click of the phone being hung up. Instead, the voice said, "An F-250? With a 360 V8? Helen was taken aback. I believe so, yes." "Good engine," the voice grunted. "Tough as nails. Where are you folks at?" "The U store it on Route 9. Another pause. "I'll be there in an hour." "Don't go anywhere." The line went dead. Helen stared at the phone. For the first time, someone hadn't said no. They hadn't said yes, either, but it was something. She found Frank in the automotive section, a massive Chilton manual open in front of him. "Someone's coming," she said. An hour later, a rusty tow truck with Hobbs Auto and Marine painted on the door pulled up to the gate of the storage facility. The man who got out was as weathered as his truck. He was tall and lean, with a shock of white hair and hands stained with a lifetime of grease. He looked to be about Frank's age. He introduced himself as Earl Hobbs. Henderson, the manager, let him in with a suspicious glare. Earl walked up to their unit, looked at the truck, then at Frank and Helen. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the truck, popped the hood, and peered inside. He grunted. He walked around to the back and kicked one of the flat tires. He ran a hand along a rusted-out section of the wheel well. Then he looked at Frank. "You think you can get this thing running?" he asked, his voice a challenge. Frank stepped forward. He was no longer the defeated man from the motel room. He was a craftsman being judged by a peer. "I can," he said, his voice firm. "I need a new battery, starter solenoid, plugs, wires, cap, and rotor. All the belts are shot. Hoses are dry-rotted. Need a fuel pump and a filter. And I'll have to drop the tank and clean it out. God knows what's been growing in there for 20 years. Earl listened, nodding slowly. He was listening not just to the words, but to the knowledge behind them. This was the language of his tribe. He looked at Frank's hands, gnarled but clean. Then he looked at Helen, standing straight and proud despite her worn clothes. He saw their dignity. He saw their desperation. "All right," Earl said finally. He walked back to his tow truck and opened a large toolbox on the side. He pulled out a heavy-duty battery, a set of sockets, and a collection of wrenches. He set them on the ground. "This is a loaner set. Don't lose him." He pulled a small notepad from his shirt pocket. "Give me the list of parts you need." Frank recited the list, and Earl wrote it all down. "I'll have it for you tomorrow morning. I'll leave it here with Henderson." He paused, looking them both in the eye. "I'm not a charity. This is a line of credit. You get this truck running, you come to my shop and work it off. Or you pay me cash. Your choice." Helen felt a wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It wasn't a handout. It was a professional courtesy. It was an act of solidarity from one old tradesman to another. "Thank you, Mr. Hobbs," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Earl," he corrected her, "and don't thank me yet. You got a hell of a lot of work to do." He got back in his tow truck and drove away, leaving them with a battery, a set of tools, and a fragile, burgeoning sense of hope. The arrival of the tools and parts transformed the storage unit into a workshop. Frank was a man reborn. He worked with a focused, methodical intensity that Helen hadn't seen in years. He was in his element. The years of forced retirement fell away, and he was once again Frank the mechanic, a man who understood the intricate metal heart of a machine. He spent the first day just cleaning. He scraped away 20 years of grime from the engine block, revealing the solid iron beneath. He methodically disconnected the old, cracked hoses and rotten belts, laying them out on the concrete floor like archaeological finds. Helen worked beside him, cleaning the tools, organizing the new parts, her bookkeeper's mind creating a mental inventory of every nut and bolt. The work was hard and slow. Frank had to contort his aging body into awkward positions to reach buried components. His knuckles were soon scraped and bleeding. His back ached constantly, but he never complained. Each small victory, a bolt loosened after a long struggle, a new part fitted securely into place, was a step away from the motel room, a step towards self-sufficiency. They discovered the truck had good bones. The frame was solid. The engine, a big Ford 360, was a simple, powerful beast built to last. "They don't make them like this anymore," Frank would mutter, a note of reverence in his voice. "No computers, no plastic nonsense, just iron and steel." While Frank worked on the engine, Helen focused on the cryptic note from her father. "The real value isn't what you see, but what holds it together." She sat on an overturned bucket, the note in her hand, and just looked at the truck. What holds it together? She thought of the frame, the chassis. She thought of the engine bolts. It all seemed too literal. Her father was more clever than that. She started paying closer attention to Frank's work, watching where he put his hands, what he examined. One evening, he was working on the fuel system. He had unbolted the gas tank and was struggling to lower it. Helen helped him, and they wrestled the heavy, rust-covered tank out from under the truck. As they set it down, Frank grunted. "Thing's heavier than it should be." He knocked on it with his knuckles. It made a dull thud. He spent the next day cleaning it out. It was a foul job, and the smell of old, varnished gasoline filled the unit. When he was done, he knocked on it again. Still heavy. He ran his hand along the top of the tank, the side that was normally hidden against the truck bed. "That's funny," he said, his voice muffled. "Come here, Helen." She knelt beside him. He pointed to a seam running along the top of the tank. "This isn't a factory weld," he said. "It's too clean, too precise. And look here. He pointed to another spot. This tank is made of stamped steel. But this section here, this is plate. It's thicker. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. It's a false top. Helen's heart began to beat faster. What held it together? The welds. The welds were holding a secret. Frank looked at the loaner tools from Earl. He had a grinder with a cutting wheel. This is going to make a hell of a lot of noise, he said. They waited until late that night, long after the last of the other storage unit owners had gone home. The industrial park was silent, save for the distant hum of the highway. Frank put on a pair of safety glasses he'd found in the glove box. He took the grinder in his hands, the tool feeling comfortable and familiar. He took a deep breath. Here goes nothing, he said, and touched the cutting wheel to the weld. A shower of brilliant orange sparks erupted in the dim light, and a high-pitched scream filled the small space. It was the sound of discovery. Frank worked carefully, following the non-standard weld seam around the top of the tank. The air filled with the sharp, metallic smell of hot steel. It took him nearly an hour, his arms trembling with the strain of holding the heavy tool steady. Finally, with a loud groan, the last section of the weld gave way. He set the grinder down, his hands shaking. He took a pry bar and carefully worked it into the cut seam. He leveraged it, and a square section of the gas tank's top, about 2 feet by 3 feet, lifted up like a lid. They both peered into the dark cavity. It was not empty. The space was tightly packed with objects wrapped in thick, oil-soaked canvas. Frank reached in and lifted out the first package. It was heavy. He placed it on the concrete floor and carefully unwrapped it. Inside, nestled in the canvas, were tools. But not just any tools. They were old, impossibly well-made, some with custom-molded wooden handles, worn smooth with use. There were strange, specialized wrenches and gauges that Frank had only ever seen in old textbooks. They were her father's tools, handcrafted and preserved like sacred relics. "My God," Frank whispered, picking up a strange-looking caliper. "I've never even seen one of these in person." They unwrapped the other packages. More tools, each one a work of art. And at the very bottom of the hidden compartment, there was a heavy, sealed metal box. It was an old military surplus ammunition can, the lid clamped down tight. Frank worked the latch open. With a hiss of escaping air, the seal broke. Inside was not a treasure trove of gold or cash. It was something far more in keeping with Helen's father. The box was filled with old ledgers, the kind with green-tinted paper and red vertical lines. And tucked between the pages of the ledgers were bundles of paper. Bearer bonds, dozens of them, issued by various municipalities and corporations in the 1950s and 60s. They were old, but they had no expiration date. They were payable to whoever held them. Helen lifted one of the ledgers. Her father's familiar script filled the pages. He had kept meticulous records of every side job he ever did, every small, interest-free loan he made to a neighbor, every favor he was owed. He was, in his own way, the secret banker of his small community. The bonds were his savings, his life's work, hidden away in the most unassuming place he could think of. Helen began to laugh. It was a strange, rusty sound, a sound she hadn't made in months. It started as a choked sob and grew into a full-throated, cathartic laugh. Frank looked up, startled, then a slow grin spread across his own grimy face. They sat there on the floor of the dusty storage unit, surrounded by antique tools and stacks of old paper, and they laughed until tears streamed down their faces. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't enough to make them rich. But it was enough. It was seed money. It was a lifeline. It was proof that they had not been entirely erased. Helen's father, a man dead for 20 years, had reached across time and saved them. The first thing they did with the money was the most satisfying. Helen took one of the smaller bonds to a downtown bank. The young teller was confused and had to call her manager. The manager, a man in his 50s, looked at the bond, then at Helen, and a look of dawning respect came over his face. He led her to his office, and, an hour later, she walked out with a cashier's check for $5,000. Their first stop was a cheap diner, where they ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, steak and eggs. They ate in silence, the simple act of eating a hot, plentiful meal feeling like the height of luxury. The second stop was a motel, a clean one, this time with fresh sheets and a window that looked out onto a small patch of grass. That night, Helen slept for 10 hours straight, a deep, dreamless sleep free from the rumble of highway trucks. The next morning, they went to see Earl Hobbs. They found him in his cluttered, cavernous shop, wrestling with the engine of an old boat. He looked up as they came in, wiping his hands on an already blackened rag. Helen handed him an envelope. Inside was cash to cover the cost of the parts, plus an extra $200. For the tool rental, she said, and for the trust. Earl counted the money, his expression unreadable. He pushed the $200 back across the counter toward her. The tools were a loan, not a rental, he said gruffly. And you don't pay for trust. You earn it. He looked at Frank. You get the heap running. Not yet, Frank said. But I will. I need to finish the fuel system. And I'll need to buy 4 new tires. You buying for me? Earl asked. I am, Frank said. Earl nodded, satisfied. A transaction had been completed. A relationship had been forged. He was no longer just an ally. He was a business partner. With the seed money from the bonds and the new, profound sense of momentum it gave them, their world began to expand. The truck was no longer just a means of escape. It was the foundation of a new plan. Frank, with the right parts and his own father-in-law's incredible tools, worked with a renewed passion. A week later, he was ready. Helen stood by the open door of the storage unit as Frank climbed into the cab. Okay, Helen, he called out. Cross your fingers. He turned the key. The engine turned over, a slow, grinding churn. It caught, sputtered, and died. He tried again. Churn, catch, sputter, d. Helen held her breath. On the third try, he pumped the gas pedal. The engine churned, it caught, it sputtered, and then, with a great roaring cough that sent a plume of black smoke billowing out of the exhaust pipe, it thundered to life. The sound was deafening, magnificent. It was the sound of resurrection. The whole truck shuddered with the raw power of the big V8, an engine silent for 2 decades, now roaring its defiance. Frank sat in the driver's seat, his hand on the vibrating steering wheel, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. Their first drive was to a tire shop, where Frank proudly paid cash for 4 new, heavy-duty tires. The ride was rough, the steering was loose, and the brakes were soft, but it was their vehicle. They were mobile. They were free. They left the storage unit for the last time, waving goodbye to a nonplussed Henderson. They were, in a sense, homeless. But they had a home, a loud, gas-guzzling, seafoam green and rust-colored home on wheels. They spent the next few weeks living out of the truck, parking in quiet industrial parks or remote corners of Walmart parking lots. They used the money from another bond to buy clothes, a small camp stove, and other essentials. But they knew this wasn't a permanent solution. They needed a base. They needed a home. Helen began scouring local real estate listings, not for houses, but for something else. She was looking for cheap land, derelict properties, places nobody else wanted. She found a listing for a 1-acre plot of land on the industrial outskirts of a small town called Harmony. The property was a mess. It had once been a small auto body shop, but the business had failed years ago. The main building was a cinder block garage with a collapsed roof. The yard was a graveyard of rusted car parts and overgrown weeds. The property was in foreclosure, and the bank was selling it as is for a pittance, barely more than the back taxes owed. They drove the truck out to see it. It was even worse than the pictures. The air of failure and neglect hung heavy over the place. It's a disaster, Frank said, looking at the collapsed roof. It's a start, Helen countered. She looked past the weeds and the rust. She saw the concrete slab of the garage. She saw the space. She saw the potential. The slab is good. The walls are still standing. You can fix the roof, Frank. We can clean this up. We have the truck to haul away the junk. We can make this a home and a business. The idea took root. A repair shop. Frank could work on cars. With his skills and Earl's connections for parts, they could make a living. A real living on their own terms. They wouldn't be taking, they would be building. They used the money from the largest of the bonds to buy the property outright. The day the deed was signed over to them, was as significant as the day the truck had started. They were landowners. They had a place in the world again. The work was monumental. They parked the truck on the property and lived in it while they began the slow process of reclamation. The first task was clearing the yard. It was backbreaking labor. Day after day, they loaded the bed of the old Ford with scrap metal, debris, and dead vegetation, and Frank would drive it to the town dump. The truck, their savior, was now their workhorse. It hauled load after heavy load, its big engine never complaining. As they cleared the land, the shape of their new life began to emerge. The cinderblock garage, once they had cleared the debris from inside, was larger than they had thought. Frank, with advice from Earl and materials bought on credit, began the arduous task of rebuilding the roof. It took him a month of working from dawn till dusk, but when the final piece of corrugated metal was screwed into place, they had a dry, secure space. They had a workshop, and in a corner of that workshop, they framed out a small, simple room. It had a concrete floor and unpainted drywall, but it had a door that locked and a roof that didn't leak. It was their first real home in almost a year. Their small, self-contained world was about to be interrupted. One afternoon, a battered sedan pulled into their gravel driveway. A young woman got out. She was hardly more than a girl, with dark, fearful eyes and a belly swollen with pregnancy. She looked at the half-finished workshop, at the old truck, at Frank and Helen sitting on overturned buckets, and seemed to hesitate. "Can we help you?" Helen asked, her voice gentle. "My car," the young woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's making a noise. I don't have much money." Her name was Maria. She was fleeing an abusive boyfriend, driving to a cousin's house 3 states away, and her car was dying. She had seen their hand-painted mechanic on duty sign, a piece of plywood Frank had nailed to a post by the road. Frank listened to the car's engine. It was a simple fix, a loose belt. He could have done it in 20 minutes. Instead, he saw the exhaustion and fear in the young woman's face. He saw her situation, a mirror of their own recent desperation. "It's the alternator belt," he told her, "but the tensioner pulley is worn out too. I'll have to get the part. It'll take till tomorrow." He knew Earl had the part in stock. He was buying her a night's rest. Helen took over. "You can't sleep in that car," she said, a statement of fact, not a question. "We have a spare room. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." Maria started to cry, silent tears of gratitude and relief. That night, she slept in their tiny, unfinished room. The next day, Frank fixed her car. He charged her only for the part, refusing any money for labor. But Maria didn't leave. She stayed for another day, and then another. She was a hard worker. She helped Helen clear weeds. She helped organize the workshop. She was quiet, but she was capable. A week later, another lost soul found his way to them. A young man named Leo, barely 20, with a backpack and the haunted look of someone who had been recently cast out. His car had broken down a mile up the road. He had been kicked out of his home by his parents for being gay. He had nowhere to go. Frank, seeing the boy's aimless despair, offered him a deal. "You can stay here. You help me in the shop, and I'll teach you what I know. You'll have a roof over your head and food to eat, and you'll learn a trade." Leo accepted. He was a quick learner, eager and intelligent. He shadowed Frank, absorbing everything. He learned how to change oil, how to diagnose a bad starter, how to weld. For the first time, he found a place where he was judged not for who he loved, but for the quality of his work. And so, their found family began to grow. The derelict property was no longer a junkyard. It was a sanctuary. Frank's repair business, with Leo's help, began to pick up. They were fair and honest, and word got around the small town of Harmony. Helen, with Maria as her apprentice, handled the books. She ran the business with the same meticulous care she had once used on corporate accounts. Every dollar was accounted for. They started a small vegetable garden in the cleared yard, and soon they were growing more than they could eat. It was a new ecosystem born from wreckage. It was a place where broken things, cars, and people could be fixed. They were not just surviving, they were thriving in their own quiet, unassuming way. They had built a life far richer and more meaningful than the sterile perfection promised by the Golden Meadows brochure. But the past was not done with them. The black BMW pulled into their gravel driveway on a bright Tuesday morning. It looked alien and predatory against the backdrop of the functional, ramshackle workshop. Mark got out. He wore an expensive suit, but it was rumpled, and he had the pale, haggard look of a man who wasn't sleeping well. He looked around at the property, at the tidy stacks of tires, the neat rows of vegetables in the garden, the industrious hum coming from the open bay doors of the garage. His expression was not one of pride or relief. It was one of baffled resentment. Helen saw him from a small office she and Maria had set up. Her heart, which had been so steady for months, gave a painful lurch. Frank and Leo emerged from under a car, wiping their hands on rags. They stood there, silent, watching him approach. "Mom? Dad," Mark said, as if he had just discovered them after a long search. "My God, I've been so worried. I didn't know where you'd gone." The lie was so audacious, so barefaced, that Helen felt a cold calm settle over her. The hurt was still there, a deep, permanent bruise on her soul, but the powerlessness was gone. She walked out of the office and stood in front of him. "You knew where we were, Mark," she said, her voice even. "We were at the Sleep-Tight Motor Inn, and then our calls stopped going through." Mark had the grace to flush. That was a misunderstanding, a terrible mix-up. The Golden Meadows deal, it was a scam. The guy took all the money and disappeared. I was ruined. I was so ashamed. I didn't know how to face you. He spread his hands in a gesture of supplication. "I lost everything." "You lost our everything, Mark," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. "But look at you now." Mark's tone shifted, becoming bright and forced. "You've landed on your feet. This is incredible. A little rustic, but you've got a real business here. Who would have thought?" He looked around again, his eyes calculating. "So this is where the rest of the money went. I guess there was more left over than I thought." Helen stared at him. He truly did not understand. He couldn't conceive of a world where they had built this from nothing. In his mind, there must have been a hidden pot of money. He couldn't see the labor, the desperation, the sheer force of will that had transformed this junkyard. "There is no money left over, Mark," she said. "You made sure of that. So what is all this, then?" he demanded, his voice losing its conciliatory tone. "You won the lottery?" "It's none of your business," Frank said, taking a step forward. Leo and Maria stood behind him, a silent, protective wall. Mark's face twisted into an ugly sneer. He looked at Maria's pregnant belly, at Leo's grease-stained clothes. "So you've collected a bunch of strays. Running a little charity here, are we? With what money? My inheritance?" The words hung in the air, obscene and unbelievable. Helen felt a surge of pure, cold anger. This was not her son. This was a stranger, a greedy, selfish man who had stolen her son's face. "There is nothing for you here, Mark," she said, her voice like ice. "The money you stole is gone. We have built this ourselves. This is our home. These are our people. You are not welcome here." "Not welcome," he scoffed. "This is my family. That makes this my property, too, in a way. I'm your only son. I have a right." He looked around, his eyes narrowed, taking in the makeshift living quarters, the tangle of wiring running to the main breaker box. "I'm not so sure this place is even legal. I bet the county would be very interested to see the kind of unpermitted operation you're running here. It would be a shame if they shut you down." It was a threat, plain and simple. He couldn't have what they had built, so he would try to destroy it. Frank took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists. But Helen put a hand on his arm. "Go," she said to Mark, her voice quiet but absolute. "Leave now, and do not come back." For a moment, Mark seemed to consider arguing. He looked at his father's stony face, at the unwavering loyalty in the eyes of Leo and Maria, and at the unyielding, unbreakable strength in his mother's gaze. He saw that he had no power here. He had lost them. He had thrown them away, and they had not only survived, they had become something he could no longer touch or control. With a final, venomous glare, he turned, got back into his expensive car, and sped away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled slowly over the quiet yard. The silence he left behind was heavy. "He'll do it," Frank said, his voice grim. "He'll call the county. Then we will be ready for them," Helen said. Her resolve had not wavered. They had faced ruin and despair. They would not be broken by a petty, vengeful boy. The battle was not over. It had just entered a new phase. True to his threat, the notice arrived a week later. It was an official letter from the County Code Enforcement Office, tacked to their front door. It cited a complaint about an unlicensed commercial operation in a residential zone and numerous potential building, electrical, and safety code violations. An inspector was scheduled to visit in 30 days. Failure to pass inspection would result in heavy fines and an order to cease all operations. The letter was designed to intimidate. For a moment, it worked. The fear was a cold knot in Helen's stomach. They had poured every last ounce of their energy and resources into this place. The thought of it being taken away by a bureaucratic decree was devastating. Frank read the letter, his face grim. He did it. The little snake. Leo and Maria were quiet, their faces etched with worry. This place was their home, too. But then Helen looked around. She saw the solid roof Frank had built. She saw the neat, organized shelves of tools. She saw the thriving garden. They had not been idle. They had been building. They just needed to make it official. 30 days, she said, her voice firm. We can do this. We just need a plan. That evening, they held a council of war around the rough-hewn table in their small kitchen. Helen, the bookkeeper, made a list. Electrical, plumbing, zoning, permits. Each category was a new mountain to climb. The next morning, Helen drove the old truck into town. Her first stop was not the county office, but Earl Hobbs's garage. She laid the letter on his cluttered counter. He read it, his expression hardening. That son of yours is a piece of work, he grunted. He tapped the letter. This is a standard threat. They send this out to scare people into shutting down. But if you fight it, and you're in the right, you can win. We want to do more than win, Earl, Helen said. We want to be legitimate. We need to pass that inspection. Earl looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. Yeah, it's Earl. Listen, I need a favor. He made 3 calls. The first was to a retired electrician named Sal, a man who had lost his pension and now did small jobs for cash. The second was to a plumber named Dave, whose daughter Frank had given a discount to just last month. The third was to his own cousin, who worked in the county planning office. Sal will come look at your wiring tomorrow, Earl said, hanging up the phone. Dave will be there Saturday to check your plumbing. And my cousin, she'll tell us exactly what we need to do to get the zoning changed from residential to mixed-use commercial. It's a long shot, but it's possible. The community, the one they had unknowingly been building with every honest repair and every act of kindness, began to rally around them. Sal the electrician showed up the next day. He spent hours tracing their makeshift wiring. It's not pretty, he said, but it's safer than half the houses in this town. We can bring it up to code. It'll take some work, but we can do it. He refused to take any money up front. Pay me when you pass inspection, he said, echoing Earl's words from months before. Dave the plumber came and helped them install a proper utility sink and run new pipes, ensuring everything was correctly vented and sealed. He brought his son, who spent the day helping Leo organize spare parts. Word spread through the small town. People who Frank had helped, customers who appreciated his honesty, began to show up. One man dropped off a load of lumber. Another, a painter, spent a weekend helping them prime and paint the interior and exterior of the workshop. A woman from a local church brought them casseroles and bags of groceries, pressing them on a flustered but grateful Helen. It was a whirlwind of activity. The 30 days were a blur of hard work and shared purpose. Frank, Leo, and Sal rewired the entire building, running everything through proper conduit and installing a new, commercial-grade breaker panel. Helen, Maria, and Dave installed new fixtures in their small apartment and the workshop bathroom. The entire community, their found family, worked from sunup to sundown. They weren't just trying to save a workshop. They were defending a home. Helen, meanwhile, navigated the bureaucratic maze of the county office. Armed with information from Earl's cousin, she filed the paperwork for a zoning variance. She created a business plan. She documented every repair they had made to the property, complete with before and after photos. She compiled a file an inch thick, a testament to their hard work and commitment. She was no longer just a bookkeeper. She was a paralegal, a project manager, and a fierce advocate for their new life. During this time, daughter Susan called. Her voice was hesitant. "Mom, I heard from Mark. He said some things about you and Dad, about calling the county on you." "He did," Helen said, her voice flat. There was a long, pained silence. "Mom, I'm so sorry," Susan finally whispered. I just went along. It was easier to believe him. "I'm so sorry." It was the apology Helen had longed to hear for a year. But now, in the midst of this new crisis, it felt distant. "We're very busy right now, Susan," she said, not unkindly. "The inspection is next week." She didn't offer absolution. She just stated the facts. The time for apologies was past. Now was the time for action. The day of the inspection arrived. The property was transformed. The yard was clean and orderly. The workshop gleamed with fresh paint. The wiring was neat, the plumbing secure. A new, official-looking sign, Harmony Auto Repair, hung over the bay doors. The inspector, a man named Peters, arrived exactly at 9 a.m. He had a clipboard and a weary, skeptical expression. He was clearly expecting to find a disaster. He started outside, checking the property lines, the waste disposal, the signage. He made notes on his clipboard, his face unreadable. He moved inside. He spent a long time in the main workshop. He looked at Sal and Frank's electrical work, tapping on the conduit, opening the breaker box. He ran the water in the utility sink, checking the plumbing. He examined their fire extinguishers, their ventilation system. Frank, Helen, Leo, and Maria stood by, silent and tense. Earl and Sal stood with them, a silent show of support. Finally, Inspector Peters finished his checklist. He stood in the middle of the workshop, clicking his pen. The silence was deafening. "Well, I got the complaint," he said slowly. "I expected to find a dangerous, illegal chop shop. That's usually what these things turn out to be." He looked around the clean, orderly space. He looked at the faces watching him, at the mix of old tradesmen and young apprentices. "This isn't a chop shop." He looked at Helen. "I reviewed your file, the zoning application, the business plan, the documentation." He tapped his clipboard. "You've done everything by the book, more than by the book. The electrical work is immaculate. The plumbing is solid. You're fully compliant." He took a form from his clipboard and signed the bottom with a flourish. "You pass," he said. He then looked at the zoning application. "And given the improvements you've made to this derelict property and the letters of support from your neighbors," he gestured to Earl and Sal, "I'm recommending the zoning variance be approved. This isn't just a garage anymore. It's an asset to the community." The relief was a physical wave that washed over the room. Helen felt her knees go weak, and Frank put a steadying arm around her. Leo let out a whoop of joy. Maria was crying again, but this time, the tears were purely happy. They had won. It was not a victory over their son. It was a victory for themselves. They had not taken revenge. They had built something sound, something honest, something that could not be torn down by bitterness or spite. They had been vindicated not by a court of law, but by a clipboard and the grudging respect of a county bureaucrat. The news of their victory spread through Harmony. The story of the old couple who had been wronged by their son and then built a new life from a junkyard, with the help of the community, became a local legend. Mark was disgraced. He had tried to use the system to destroy his parents, and the system, for once, had worked in their favor. He became a pariah in the small world he had once so easily navigated. His business partners grew wary of him. His friends distanced themselves. His fall was as swift and total as the ruin he had inflicted on his parents. A few weeks after the inspection, a reporter from the regional newspaper came to do a story. She didn't focus on the betrayal. She focused on the resurrection. She wrote about the old mechanic and his bookkeeper wife, about the young apprentices, about the network of old tradesmen who had come together to help. She called them the Junkyard Saints of Harmony. The story was picked up by a national wire service. For a brief time, their quiet, industrious life was in the spotlight. They received letters and small donations from strangers across the country, people who had been touched by their story of resilience. Helen meticulously logged every donation, and once their own debts were paid, Use the surplus to start a small, informal fund at Earl's shop, a pay-it-forward account to help the next person who came in with a broken car and a broken life. If you've made it this far in the story, you've seen the worst of people and the best of people. You've seen how kindness and competence can build a fortress that greed can't tear down. It's a reminder that the most valuable things we have are the skills in our hands and the loyalty of those who stand with us. If you believe in stories like this, if you believe in the power of resilience, hit that subscribe button and become a part of our community. What would you do in this position? Would you have sought revenge, or would you have chosen to build? Let me know in the comments below. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The workshop thrived. Frank and Leo were busy from morning till night. Their work so respected that they soon had a 2-week waiting list. Frank found a deep, quiet satisfaction in teaching his craft, in passing on a lifetime of knowledge to an eager and grateful student. Leo, in turn, blossomed under the mentorship. He was no longer the lost, scared boy who had shown up on their doorstep. He was a confident, skilled young mechanic, a vital part of their business and their family. Maria had her baby, a healthy little girl she named Hope. Helen and Frank became surrogate grandparents, doting on the child. The sound of a baby's laughter now filled the small apartment, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. Maria, with Helen's guidance, became a shrewd and efficient office manager. She handled the scheduling, the billing, and the accounts, her confidence growing with every balanced ledger. They expanded the garden, building raised beds and a small greenhouse. They grew tomatoes, squash, beans, and corn. Helen found a deep, grounding pleasure in the simple act of working the soil, of planting a tiny seed and watching it grow into something that could sustain them. The garden became a symbol of their new life, patient, nurturing, and fruitful. One Saturday afternoon, a familiar, hesitant car pulled into the driveway. It was Susan. She got out of the car alone. She looked older, tired. She carried a small, store-bought apple pie. She approached the house slowly, as if expecting to be turned away. Helen was on the small porch they had built, shelling peas into a metal bowl. She watched her daughter approach, her heart a mixture of old pain and weary compassion. Susan stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Mom," she said, her voice small. I brought a pie." "I see that," Helen said, her hands never ceasing their rhythmic work. "I know I don't deserve it," Susan said, her eyes filling with tears. "But I wanted to see you. I wanted to say it again. I am sorry. For everything. For not listening. For not being there." Helen finished shelling the last of the peas. She set the bowl aside and looked at her daughter, truly looked at her, for the first time in over a year. She saw the genuine remorse in her eyes. She saw the toll that the family's implosion had taken on her. There was no joy in her daughter's pain. There was only a great, aching sadness for all that had been lost. "Mark doesn't call anymore," Susan said quietly. "He lost his job. His wife left him. He blames you. He blames everyone but himself." Helen nodded slowly. It was the predictable, pathetic end to his story. A man who builds his life on a foundation of lies eventually finds himself living in the rubble. "The pie will get cold," Helen said, her voice soft. She stood up and opened the screen door. "The door's open, Susan." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was an invitation. It was a beginning. Susan walked up the steps and into the small, simple home her parents had built from nothing. The healing would be a long, slow process, as slow and patient as the growth of the garden outside. But for the first time, it felt possible. That evening, as the sun set, Frank and Helen sat on the porch bench Frank had built. The air was cool and smelled of cut grass and motor oil, a combination that had become the scent of home. The workshop was quiet. Leo had gone into town for a movie. Maria was inside, singing a lullaby to baby Hope. The old truck was parked in its usual spot, its rusted, seafoam green paint glowing in the last light of the day. It looked less like a machine and more like a sleeping animal, loyal and content. It had been their ark, their tool, their salvation. It was a monument to a father's foresight and a husband's skill. Frank reached over and took Helen's hand. His was calloused and stained with grease. Hers was soft, with dirt under the nails from the garden. Their hands fit together perfectly. "Your father was a smart man," Frank said, his voice a quiet rumble. "Hiding all that in the gas tank. Crazy, but smart." Helen smiled, a small, weary, contented smile. She looked out at the world they had made. It was not the life she had ever imagined, but it was a good life. It was a real life, full of hard work and small joys, a found family and earned peace. They had been thrown away, discarded like so much junk. But they had held on. They had endured. And in the end, they had built something beautiful out of the wreckage. The single light above the workshop door flickered on, a steady, unwavering beacon against the deepening twilight.